Thanks to our friends at The Motley Fool for sponsoring this video. Visit fool.com/Rive to receive the top 10 stocks to buy right now.
Yeah, so let's go through Block's numbers. I think they do a nice job kind of giving us what has happened over the last 4 quarters previously to this current quarter. So gross profit up 38% from a year ago to $1.57 billion. Net loss, which is smaller than any of the last 3 quarters. I think that's really interesting. You know, this is going to be another one of these Silicon Valley companies that, as we kind of made this shift from grow at all costs over the last, almost decade really, to, oh my gosh, we actually have to make money. What companies are going to be able to make that flip? And so this is, I think, pretty encouraging. Adjusted EBITDA, $327 million, significantly higher than both last quarter and a year ago. So that I think is pretty positive there. And then you were talking about the Cash App gross profit up 51% from a year ago. What are your thoughts on kind of these early numbers here?
Yeah. I mean, come on, if you can sustain 51% gross profit growth in a side of your business for any length of time, that is going to be a meaningful driver of the stock price. It really will.
Yeah, I totally agree there. All right, so here's the high level numbers, and they break this out into Block as a company, and then Square and Cash App, which are the 2 main drivers. What I think is interesting from a gross profit standpoint is they're about equal in size. I think a lot of people would be really surprised at that. You know, I'm in the Midwest, and I think Venmo, which is PayPal, that's one we'll talk about in a little bit, but that's much more common here. I prefer the Cash App, but you know, you do get a network effect with these payment solutions and these peer-to-peer solutions. But Cash App got a massive market, and they've built a huge business in this that's generating almost as much money as Square, which is kind of shocking if you aren't a big user of this app.
And I'm drilling down into these numbers a little bit more for Cash App and looking. It says that they had 59 million transacting actives in September, so users essentially of the Cash App, and that is up 20% year over year. So that's really meaningful adoption growth there.
Did they have their customer acquisition costs? Because I know they've covered that in the past, where the numbers are kind of crazy. It was something like your customer acquisition cost was like $5 or $10, and the gross margin per customer is like $50 a year or something like that. I mean, it was one of those businesses where you go, oh my gosh, grow this as fast as you possibly can. Are they still calling that out?
They typically don't have that in the report every quarter. It's more in the investor day presentations, things like that I've seen it. I'm not seeing it right now. Doesn't mean it's not in here. We're getting this fresh, but yeah, it's something along those lines. It's around $5 to acquire a customer.
Here is another, I think, telling number for this. This is kind of going to give you the trend of what our business is doing. This is the Square GPV is gross payment volume, and 2020. It's interesting. The pandemic was actually pretty bad for Square because if you think about their business, yes, it's a digital business, but it's oftentimes a business that you're using in person. You're not necessarily. This isn't Shopify where you go out and build an online store and then people are going to interact with you only online. It's more so something that really caught hold at taco or food trucks and, you know, real small business, like, you know, fireworks stands was always one that I think it's like that doesn't exist without a company like Square. So they took a bigger hit than you might have thought in the early phase of the pandemic when a lot of their customers had to shut down. And then it's been kind of a slow crawl back. So I think this is really interesting that a year ago, $41.7 billion in gross payment volume, and now they're at $50 billion. And then they break this out here, 125,000 or less in annualized gross payment volume. That would be what they kind of consider their small businesses, up pretty significantly, almost $2 billion to 15.8. And then medium-sized businesses growing pretty nicely, up $2.2 billion. And then where they've made huge inroads over the last couple of years is with bigger retailers and that is up $4.4 billion to $19.9 billion. So that's becoming a bigger and bigger piece of the business, which I think is really interesting given the trajectory that Square's on.
Yeah. So to answer your earlier question, Travis, I do see here that it says Cash App marketing expenses up 5% year over year. However, we just noted that there was 20% year over year user growth. So to me, that's a nice in the right direction number there.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. Here's another one that I think is, again, these are just, I have no idea what the market is doing or how it's reacting right now, but gross profit in markets outside the US, this was always one of the criticisms of Square, is that it was a very US centric company.
Yeah.
And gross profit, look at this, goes back to 2018 and just steadily growing up over 100% in the past year. So I think that's a pretty good sign for where the business is growing, where they have the opportunity to grow, because it's not just everywhere, right? If you're an established business, it's pretty challenging to change payment systems. But if you're starting a new business, that's where they're going to get a lot of their customers, and then you can move internationally. That's another place for them to grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do they even mention Bitcoin?
Yes. So they took a $2 million impairment loss on the Bitcoin because they do have some on their balance sheet, I guess you could say. So with the value of Bitcoin down, you do take that impairment loss.
All right, here's the next thing that I want to highlight, and I brought this up a minute ago, but that is the subscription and service-based revenue. Again, this is where Square is really going to make their money long-term. This is businesses paying for different services, typically cloud services that tie into the Square app. And so this is a recurring, or literally as it's called, a recurring revenue source. And this is what makes small businesses go. Revenue in 2019 in the third quarter was $99 million. Now we're up to $332 million. So since the pre-pandemic, this business has more than tripled. That's a pretty massive growth number. And then on the bottom here, it excludes PPP forgiveness and other contributions from buy now, pay later. On that basis, it's more than doubled. So I think, transaction volume can kind of tell you the direction of the business. Is it growing or is it not? But like we talked about, it's not necessarily where the profit's going to come from. This is where the profit's going to come from. And so I think this is a really good trend for Square to be showing right now.
I'm looking here down in the Bitcoin revenue. I know that we're going to talk about cryptocurrency here in a moment, but it looks like Bitcoin revenue only down single-digit percentage, maybe 1%. It's not very much on a year-over-year basis. Now, of course, if you are familiar with Block, they're not making any money off of Bitcoin. They're just facilitating the transaction. But still, that's interesting because that says that roughly the same amount of Bitcoin transactions right now as there was this time last year, which I don't know what that means for Coinbase, but that's an interesting data point.
Yeah, and they've always been really interesting in how they report their numbers, because Bitcoin, the way they aren't facilitating a transaction between third parties, they're actually taking custody of the Bitcoin. So if you are buying Bitcoin from the Cash App, you're actually buying it from Block. So they're recording it as revenue, even though the margin that they're making is like tiny. And so that's why you'll see it's been really confusing the last couple of years, because it'll be like $4 billion in revenue and gross margin is like $10 million. So,
and it's why you can't really look at Block on a price to sales basis,
right?
Because how much of the sales is just Bitcoin, which really isn't material to the business at all. So you look at it and it's like, oh, it's trading at 1.5 times sales. Okay, well, yeah, don't use that metric in valuing Block.
All right, what are I'm gonna look up the stock, what the stock has done after market. I like to look at these before looking at the stock. What's your reaction to what we've seen from the earnings report so far?
Happy. Yeah, more business as usual. I mean, I'm used to big numbers in the gross profit growth. I'm used to, I mean, yeah, I should be really excited about 51% or whatever it was growth for the Cash App ecosystem. I feel like I'm a little bit muted because I've come to expect something comparable there. It is a fast growing piece of this business.
Yeah, what's interesting here is this stock is down to 80%. I mean, it's down
From
a
its all-time
lot.
high?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think
But
it was pushing 300 at one point.
yeah, but if you look at the business is still doing really well. And this is where I think we're in a really confusing place in the market where stocks are down, and so then that makes investors just generally think the sentiment is down in that business or the market that they're in. I don't see anything terrible about these results. If you were just flown in and said, "Hey, look at these results," and have no context about what's going on with the stock price, I think you would say, "Hey, this is a great company. They're growing like crazy. I'm in." And
Yeah.
it looks like stock's up about 12% after hours. This is one of my biggest holdings, so I'm happy to see that. But I'm happy to see the momentum in the business. I think is the bottom line.
Well, and I think to your point again, I was just reading Morgan Housel this morning, The Psychology of Money, and one of the things he says in there is we prefer simple narratives because sometimes the details are just too complex and we don't like that. So we prefer to tell these simple stories to explain what's going on. And oftentimes, like you just said, the stock is down 80%. What's the simple narrative there? The simple narrative is, oh, Block must be failing in some way. We don't prefer to dig down into the context. And yeah, if you do, it tells a quite different story here with Block. This is a stock that I just added to last month. I just increased my position by 33%. So it is one of my largest holdings as well.
Nice. Yeah, I think a lot to like here. And the surprising thing to me is that the Cash App is still just growing like crazy, and then it's almost the same size from a gross profit standpoint as the Square business is, which has been established for what, a decade now.
Yeah.
So I think that's really encouraging. Now we'll see what the conference call they say on the conference call, but how they're integrating buy now pay later, and then some sort of crypto TBD something or other. Well, that's where the next leg of growth might come from. Can they somehow use crypto rails instead of credit card rails to lower their transaction costs, maybe increase margins per transaction? We will see. That's kind of to be determined. But right now, I think a lot to like about this stock.